I converted the camel hours into scout car hours, took compass bearings, drove cautiously along the indicated tracks and came right on my battalion. There, great agitation had reigned. Shortly before dark, patrols had been sent out, which had found their way back to the battalion only by means of light signals without finding me. Finally, the Royal Dragoons and the IITH Hussars were asked if they had taken me prisoner. Sorry, unfortunately. No, we would have liked to greet your commander here. Christmas 1942 arrived, but we had no time to celebrate. In any case, how? Deep in the desert, without a tree or a bush, and in the heat of day, our thoughts turned to home, where our families were having to endure air raids and food rationing. On the 31st of December, New Year's Eve, Rommel came to see me unexpectedly in his Fieseler stork. He briefed me on the situation and his plans. Look, sometime or other, Tommy is going to launch another attack and outflank the Burat position in the south. I need the remains of the panzer divisions in the north. The reconnaissance group will be reconstituted in the next few days. Linau and Voss will join you, and you will get back the Fieseler stork, which will help you to reconnoiter. I am very concerned, Rommel went on, that the Americans, with their vast potential in weapons, might make a thrust from the Atlas Mountains and cut us off at Gabes from the 10th Army in northern Tunisia. Marshal Bastico shares my view that we cannot allow the Africa Army to be destroyed at Burat. I have suggested transferring the remains of the 21st Panzer Division to southern Tunisia, to rest them there and to ward off a possible American attack. Rommel then repeated what he had outlined to me some weeks earlier. I still think that, in view of the disastrous supply situation and the state of our men, who are certainly experienced but far from fresh, we can no longer turn this war around, let alone win it. So I should like to get as many men and as much materiel as possible to Tunisia. There, the opportunities for defense are better, and this is my main concern. As many men as possible can be saved by the short route to Sicily. Now to you, Rommel continued. With the reconnaissance group, you will secure for me the whole area south of Homs and Tripoli. The British must, on no account, take us in the rear. Until the middle of January 1943, things remained quiet. On the 13th of January, the 21st Panzer Division was transferred to the Mareth position in southern Tunisia, and rested. As yet, the Americans were showing no signs of an eastward move from the rugged Atlas Mountains. Voss and Linau arrived with their battalions, so did the Fieseler. We kept watch in a broad fan to the south. Contacts were resumed with our friends on the other side. Very much to my surprise, my battalion was transferred to the area southwest of Tripoli for a few days, to be restored to strength. Major Voss took command of the rest of the reconnaissance group. The quiet spell in a palm grove did us good. Replacements of men, ammunition, and fuel arrived. I used the opportunity for a brief visit to Tripoli. In the bar of the Waden Hotel, the Italian barman served me a cocktail. I shall probably have to serve the next one to Montgomery, he said. The Italians took things more lightly. On the 13th of January, I was back with the reconnaissance group. On the 14th, with massive artillery and air support, the British moved against the Burat position. They then made a strong thrust south of the Burat position toward Tarhuna Homs, hence, practically against Tripoli already. My reconnaissance group, along with elements of the 164th Division and the paratroops, were at once sent in to counter this move. Despite considerable losses in tanks, the thrust was continued fairly successfully toward Garion and Azizia. With that, the British were already southwest of Tripoli. Thanks to the long-range desert group, a complete tank division had found a route over a rugged mountain terrace. The Homs-Tarhuna position was in great danger. To avoid annihilation, Rommel had it evacuated. On the 20th of January, we heard, even far to the south, the rumble of explosions in Tripoli. As I discovered later, through the superhuman efforts of the supply units, about 95% of the stores were moved to safety from Tripoli. In the direction of Tunisia, all harbor and supply installations were blown up and the food depots handed over to the Italian mayor. On the 23rd of January, the British occupied Tripoli without a fight. A few days later, as we were covering the disengagement of our units southwest of Tripoli, a patrol reported, gathering of high military personnel about 6 to 8 kilometers to the northeast. Believe Monty identified, strong protection with tanks and scout cars. I went there at once and scanned the scene with binoculars. It really did seem to be Montgomery, and, much more sensationally, Churchill appeared to be with him, wearing a safari helmet. It was too far to open fire with our weapons. 88mm guns and artillery were not available. I, at once, sent a radio message to Gauze, Churchill and Monty believed located at great distance, no action possible. Actually, I thought about what Rommel said about Churchill and held my fire. Later, I heard that it could well have been Churchill, who, on his way to Casablanca, had stopped off to see Monty and his troops. However that may be, we never saw Hitler in this theater of war, or even senior officers of the high command of the Wehrmacht, the OKW. In January, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling of the Long-Range Desert Group was finally captured. "Nice to meet you," was his first remark. "I shall be glad to spend a few days with you and perhaps meet your famous Marshal Rommel." He was taken to HQ under heavy guard. A day or two later he promptly escaped. After a mistaken deal with Bedouin, however, he was handed back to us. The British paused to organize their supplies. By an immense effort, continually harassed by the RAF, we were able to bring all our units over the Libyan-Tunisian border to the Marith position. With the reaching of Tunisia, the reconnaissance group was again dissolved. I also had to relinquish the Faisalar again, unfortunately. I received orders to stop, or at least report, any approach by British units south of Marith. I was to pay particular attention to the track that led north from the desert fort of Foum Tadouine. That was where the French column was expected, which, in an unprecedented feat, was supposed to strike from Chad through the Sahara, against our southern flank. It failed to reach Tunisia in time. I sent a liaison officer to Rommel's HQ to learn something about the situation and about intentions for the future in our struggle in Tunisia. On his return, he told me that Rommel seemed to be planning an attack through the American-held passes in the Atlas Mountains, in order to score a hit against the completely untried Americans, and thrust north in their rear. Reconnaissance Battalion 3 was to hold itself ready for this operation. Shortly after, an orderly officer arrived from Rommel with an anti-aircraft platoon and one of light artillery. "Major," he said, "your task is as follows, since Rommel considers it possible that the British may attempt a wide, outflanking movement from the south, or that the French combat. If no enemy is observed, your combat group will return at once to the Marith position. You will set off for the south tomorrow morning. Radio contact must be maintained without fail." Well spread out, we made good progress at first, until a British reconnaissance plane flew over us, circled, and flew off again. That was sinister. I sent off a radio message to Gauze. "Expect air attack on my combat group. Can you alert our fighters? Progress toward Foum Tadouine otherwise good." Then they came, flying out of the sun and low over the ground. The Hurricanes attacked, protected by Spitfires, which kept watch high above them. No special orders were needed. All movement ceased. Every man left his vehicle and lay flat on the sand 30 yards away. My motorcycle escorts opened fire with their machine guns, but without success. We did not know that the Hurricanes were armored on the underside. Their target was the Flak platoon anti-aircraft platoon, which was eliminated before it could fire a shot. On their second run-up, the artillery platoon was hit and its vehicles badly damaged. As fast as they had come, the fighters turned away again. Everything had lasted only a few minutes. The Hurricanes must have seen my armored reconnaissance vehicles. I figured we were in for a second attack. Again, I sent off a radio message. "Have been attacked by Hurricanes. Flak and artillery platoons largely out of action. Anticipate fresh attack. Send Messerschmitts." The British bases must have been close behind the front. After barely an hour, they were back again. This time, it was the turn of our armored vehicles. With dismay, I saw only a few yards away how the Hurricanes fired rockets, which went straight through our armor. That was new to us. The only one to remain in his vehicle was my radio operator, who was sending off my messages. Next to the vehicle stood my intelligence officer, who passed on to the operator what I shouted across to him. Then a machine I thought I recognized the Canadian emblem approached for a low-flying attack on the armored radio station. At 20 yards, I could clearly see the pilot's face under his flight helmet. But instead of shooting, he signaled with his hand for the radio officer to clear off, and pulled his machine up into a great curve. "Get the operator out of the vehicle," I shouted, "and take cover, the pair of you." The machine had turned and now came at us out of the sun for the second time. This time, he fired his rockets and hit the radio car, fortunately, without doing too much damage. Except for 2 vehicles, which we had to abandon, all were in running order, though we had to take several in tow with our tracked motorcycles. But the British fighters were still circling over us. We had to anticipate a third attack. Suddenly, a squadron of Messerschmitts appeared high in the sky and, at once, engaged the British in an air battle. They moved off to the north, but not before we saw one British machine go down after being hit. So, at least a third attack had been prevented and we had had the satisfaction of one shot down. We at once moved off again toward Tatooine. We were now in the middle of the desert, which, in this part, was flat and provided easy going. By radio, I notified General Gauze. And then we saw the little desert fort lying before us. A heap of stones piled on top of each other, not a tree or a bush. What an enervating existence for the garrison, to keep watch there for months or years. We were met by machine gun fire, which we very quickly silenced with our own MG-24. Secured by our motorcycle escorts and 2 guns that were still intact, and under the immediate protection of armored cars, I drove into the fort. A French captain came toward us. His men had laid down their weapons and raised their hands. "Why are you still here?" I asked him, "now that the front has moved on to Tunisia?" "We have been stationed here for over a year," he replied. "Our task is to keep the fort manned. I have no other orders." I went with him into his bare office, where I saw a radio set. At a sign from me, it was put out of action by my intelligence officer. "Regard yourself and your men as prisoners," I told him. "Pack whatever you need, I shall have to take you with us." Meantime, all the elements of my little combat group had appeared in the fort and searched it for weapons. I, at once, sent out patrols to the south and the southeast, which reported no contact with the enemy. I radioed to Gauze. Tatooine occupied, garrison taken prisoner. Radio destroyed. Reconnaissance far to the south, no contact with enemy. And returning to Mareth position with combat group and several vehicles in tow. We were still a good 50 kilometers from Mareth when it became dark. I decided to stay in the middle of the desert for the night. There was little danger. The British also suspended their movements during the night. The next day, we reached the Mareth lines unmolested, and were withdrawn behind them as reserves for further actions. I used the opportunity to be briefed by General Gauze. "Rommel's idea," said Gauze, "is to use the freshly equipped 21st Panzer Division in collaboration with the newly arrived Loth Panzer Division of Colonel General von Arnim, along with all available elements of the Afrika Korps, to disrupt American concentrations, prevent an advance against the coast, and thrust as deeply as possible into the American rear. Because of the Americans' complete lack of experience," said Gauze, "Rommel considers this operation to be very promising. The Italians are to consolidate the Mareth position and hold it by every means, although a defensive position at and west of Gabes would have been very much more favorable because of the Salt Lakes. But Mussolini and the Italian Commando Supremo insisted on the Mareth position. Unfortunately, the collaboration with von Arnim did not go very well. He likes to be his own boss," Gauze concluded. "Thank goodness the heavy rains are still with us, as they make it almost impossible for the raft to be used. Your battalion will reconnoiter west of Gabes to prevent our elements of the 5th Panzer Army, in the north, from being cut off. Rommel's health is not good, but he wants to stick it out with his men and calculates that he still has a chance if his plan is approved." We took hope again and made ourselves familiar with the terrain, which was so different from the desert. In the Atlas Mountains, we would be concerned with passes and steep mountaintops, in the plain with salt lakes, and, further north, with cultivated land. "Rommel has just received a radio message from the Commando Supremo," Gauze went on, "to the effect that, owing to his poor state of health, on reaching the Mareth position, he is to relinquish command of it to the Italian General Messa, who, up to now, has been commanding the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia. Rommel can determine the date of his relief. Rommel's plan seems to be aimed at 2 solutions. Either we receive, from Sicily, all the necessary materiel in tanks including the superior Tiger, anti-tank weapons, ammunition, and massive air support, or we try to thrust deep into the rear of the Americans, occupy the main passes, and hold up the British at the Mareth position, in order, by this means, to evacuate from Tunisia the mass of battle-tried troops urgently needed in Europe. The second solution, unfortunately, would seem to be the most likely. Hold yourself ready for a thrust against the Americans." While the Italians settled in to defend the Mareth position, The fully restored 21st Panzer Division moved against the Fade Pass on February 1943, to create a starting point for the northward attack behind the American lines. The surprised and Imperial lost the pass and 1,000 prisoners. A Marathon. In the middle of February, my old division set out from the Fade Pass bridgehead, to the north, and came upon elements of the 2nd American Armored Division. In hard battles, tank against tank, the bulk of this American division was destroyed and a large number of Grant, Lee, and Sherman tanks left burning on the battlefield. In its pursuit, the 21st Division managed to gain further territory against the remaining American elements, now fighting grimly. The loss of about 150 tanks and 1,600 prisoners forced the Americans to surrender. Also, the important town of Gafsa, which gave us our starting point against the north. Combat groups of the Africa Army and the 5th Panzer Army thrust on at once to the southwest, the west, and the north. Large quantities of fuel were captured, and the Americans set fire to 30 aircraft on an advanced flying field. My Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion moved up, in order to advance north out of the Gafsa area and give the Americans no chance to rest. From Gaz, I heard that Rommel wanted to strike against Tebessa, hence, far into the enemy's rear. To the Commando Supremo, however, and also to von Arnim, this W made too risky. They could not, and would not, follow Rommel's plans. So orders were given merely to thrust against El Kef, far too close behind the Anglo-American front. During the night of the 18th or the 19th of February, I was given the task of taking the Kasserine Pass in a surprise coup and of holding it for the following units. With the motorcycle escorts in front, I moved off before dawn in the hope of catching the Americans unawares. They were on the alert, however, and straddled us with heavy artillery fire, which was directed by observers stationed on the heights on either side of the way through the pass. I could not get through. Neither could a rifle regiment that was sent in against the pass. All the same, we took a few prisoners, who belonged to the 34th U.S. Division. We were surprised by the first-class equipment of the men, and, most of all, by the daily ration that everyone had on him. It was not just the bar of chocolate, the chewing gum, butter, and cigarettes, which, for us, were unaccustomed treats. We were fascinated by the printed slip that was enclosed with each package. In one respect, they seemed to have the edge over their British allies. They were extraordinarily flexible. They adapted immediately to a changed situation and fought with great doggedness. I will never forget the sight of a few Tiger Panzers, with their superior 88mm tank gun, knocking out one Sherman after the other, as they tried to advance through a pass to the east, and could not understand that they were hopelessly inferior to the Tigers. We admired the courage and 61 in with which the Americans executed their attacks, even though we sometimes felt sorry for them at having to pay for their first combat experience with such heavy losses. We discovered later, in Italy, and I personally in the battles in France in 1944, how quickly the Americans were able to evaluate their experience and, through flexible and unconventional conduct of a battle, convert it into results. Our thrust to the north, begun so hopefully, came to a standstill, owing to the false start against El Kef on the one hand, and on the other, to inadequate supplies. In addition, after heavy downpours of rain, we made progress only with difficulty and, in the mountain valleys, we were straddled, time and again, by enemy artillery. We had to withdraw to the Kasserine Pass, while in the north, the 5th Panzer Army started a relief attack, which failed to penetrate the Anglo-American resistance. At the end of February, Rommel became Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Africa, with the residual armies under General Messa in the south and under Colonel General von Arnim in the north. The front was terribly long and could be manned at only a few points. The material, especially that of the Americans, was overwhelming. Rommel would now have liked to give up the south of Tunisia and, with the remains of the army group, form a strong bridgehead around the city of Tunis, with the Cape Bon Peninsula, in order to start evacuating from there, at least a part of the battle-tried Africa Army. The plan was rejected. At the beginning of March, I heard from Gaz that Rommel intended flying to Führer HQ in order to save what there was to save. As I happened to be in reserve, my battalion had hardly any armored cars or ammunition left. I went to Rommel's command post, which was not far away. May I speak to Rommel and say goodbye to him? I asked Gaz. Of course, he will be glad to see the commander of his favorite battalion. Rommel sat in his mammoth, as always, with his campaign maps before him. I had not seen him for some weeks and was shocked at how unwell he looked. He was visibly weak, suffering from tropical disease, and completely worn out. Still, he had that unique sparkle in his eyes. Field Marshal, I have heard that you intend flying to HQ. From the state of things here, I don't think you will be coming back. As commander of the battalion, which was once the first to land in North Africa and has been allowed to fight every battle with you, may I, in the name of each individual member of my battalion, say goodbye to you, till we meet again, sometime, somewhere. We will hold out here for as long as we can, always after the example you have given us. Rommel stood up. He had tears in his eye. What must have been going on inside this man, who had always been hard on himself and had identified himself with his men in the theater of war? I had never mentioned these tears to anyone until, long after the war and my captivity, I met his wife, Lucy, and told her of her husband's prophecy and of his tears. Rommel's tears, the tears of a great man now cast down, moved me as much as anything I saw in the war. Rommel went to a cupboard on the wall and came back with a large photograph, which showed him as a healthy and successful man. He signed his likeness with a dedication. Here, Luck, take this in gratitude and appreciation of your brave battalion. Keep well. I hope we shall see each other again at home. God be with you. He turned around and I left him, deeply moved. On the 9th of March, Rommel flew to Germany. Now, everything happened very quickly. Colonel General von Arnim took command of Army Group Africa, supported by General Gauze, the experienced general staff officer in North Africa. While every day anticipating a major offensive by Montgomery against the Mareth position, we grappled with the Americans, who tried to break through from the Atlas Mountains to the coast. We had considerable losses. On the 23rd of March, Monty made a move and with a tank corps, bypassing Mareth, swept over the weak Italian positions. The Mareth line had to be given up. The bulk of the artillery could not be brought back. At Gabes, the remains of the Panzer Army Africa tried, once again, to establish itself. My battalion had to cover the western flank. Our supply sections had already been transferred to the Cape Bon Peninsula. Then, at the end of March, an order reached me to report at once, in person, to von Arnim. I had no idea what was wanted of me. General Gauze received me. Rommel has gotten nowhere with Hitler. We shall neither receive adequate supplies, nor does the Führer want to know anything about a German Dunkirk. Rommel has been sent for treatment and forbidden to return to Africa as planned. Come, the commander-in-chief is expecting you. What did von Arnim want from me? I didn't know him nor had I ever heard anything about him. A tall, slim man with sharp features awaited me. Here to report, Colonel General, I presented myself. Good to meet you, Luck. I have the pleasure of presenting you in the name of the Duce with the Medaglia d'Argento, a decoration that corresponds roughly to our Knight's Cross. He pinned the order to my chest and handed me the certificate. I was naturally pleased and undoubtedly had my friends of the Nizza battalion to thank for the decoration. Associated with the order, there was even a small monthly pension and free first-class travel for 2 on all Italian railways for life. But von Arnim had hardly sent for me because of the order. And then it came. Luck, I have decided, in agreement with Rommel and Gauze, that you will fly, at once, to Führer HQ to lay before Hitler and explain a detailed plan for the evacuation of as many elements as possible of the Africa Army. For this, you will first fly to Rome and have the plan countersigned by Marshal Kesselring. You will then fly on to Berlin and report to Colonel General Guderian, Chief of the General Staff of the Army, and General Schmunt Bede of Army Personnel, likewise, for countersigning. You then fly to Berchtesgaden, to Führer HQ, and report to Keitel or Jody, to be given an appointment with Hitler. Wherever you go, you will keep in contact with us through a 1000-watt radio and a special code. General Seidman, Air Chief for Africa, whom I knew well, and his wife Seidefrau, from Berlin days will let you have his Heinkel. Departure as soon as possible. I am honored by the task, Colonel General, I replied, but how should I, an insignificant frontline soldier, get anywhere with Hitler? Besides, I should like to be with my men in the final phase. We have thought of all that, said von Arnim. The army generals are extremely suspect to the Führer. Even Rommel is apparently to be left out in the cold. Even after the loss of Stalingrad, Hitler sticks to his victory or death, but no retreat. That means we shall now lose about 130,000 men in North Africa, too, Men with the best combat experience and of high morale. Hitler is more likely to listen, if at all, to an insignificant major straight from the front, if you give him a clear idea of the situation and the feeling among the men. You will travel, and appear before him, in your dusty, faded uniform. That can't fail to have an effect. The plan you are taking was worked out some time ago and provides for the proportional evacuation of the most important officers, frontline soldiers, and technicians. General Gauss will discuss the details with you. I wish you, and as complete success, report daily by radio. With a shake of the hand, I was dismissed. Gauss filled out the mission. You won't be returning to your battalion, but will go to the supply base in the Cape Bon Peninsula. There, I will send you a Fieseler stork, which will take you to the airfield the day after tomorrow, early enough for you to set off before dawn. Kesselring, Guderian, and Schmunt have been informed of your coming. I don't know whether you will be allowed to come back to Africa, but try. Speed is of the CE. Every day lost makes evacuation more difficult. All the best, luck. Gauss handed me the plan in a large envelope and I was dismissed. I had to stop and take a deep breath. This mission was altogether too unexpected and momentous. After all the years of frontline service, here was a task that went far beyond the level of a battalion commander. It was not all that far to our supply base and I arrived there shortly before dark. The astonishment was suitably great when I had to tell my people that I would be flying to Germany on a Spesima mission. I at once notified Captain Bernhardt by radio. I think I may be back in a week. Keep your courage up and see that as many men as possible get back to the Cape Bon Peninsula. Give my greetings to everyone. Next day, I packed the essentials, my main baggage, including the picture of Rommel, I left behind in my command car. In the afternoon, the Fieseler landed at our base. Its young pilot told me I had to be on the airfield at about 5:30 in the morning, so that the Heinkel could cross the Mediterranean before Spitfires made the airspace unsafe. Then, several officers appeared from the Nizza battalion, which had been almost wiped out and had only one diminutive patrol fit for service that was still in action. They brought along a few bottles of Chianti and handed me letters and packets for their families in Italy, which I was to take with me. In the evening, we all squatted together under the palms. No sound of battle was to be heard. Everything appeared so peaceful and unreal. It was later than I would have wished. The pilot of the Fieseler had to wake me up. We were behind schedule. One last wave from the machine and we set off as dawn was breaking. The Heinkel was standing ready with engines running. The Fieseler taxied up to the entrance hatch. The pilot, apparently a very experienced sergeant, called out to me from the cockpit, "Hurry, Major, hurry, we were late, the Spitfires will soon be there." I had to lie flat in the nose cone and as front gunner. Man the 20mm cannon. There was no other way of transporting me. "Are you familiar with the cannon, Major?" the pilot asked over the intercom. "Listen, we had this gun in our scout cars when you were still wetting your pants," I replied. "Okay, try it out, please." As soon as we were over the sea, "We shall be flying very low," came the pilot's voice. The day was dawning in the east as we lifted off with engines roaring. After a few minutes, we were over the sea, about 30 to 50 feet, I guessed, above the UFI roofied surface of the water. So I put in a magazine, fed it through, and pressed the trigger. Nothing. I fed through again nothing. "What kind of a stupid gun is this?" I shouted to the pilot. I tried again, and finally half dismantled the cannon. I fed through again nothing. The pilot was getting anxious. "We need your gun in case British fighters attack from the front. Please keep trying, it's already light outside." I was now fully occupied with the bloody gun and saw nothing, where or how high we were flying, or whether British fighters might appear out of the blue. Suddenly, the pilot drew the machine up. We were getting near Sicily, his voice came through, "Soon be out of danger." I hardly heard him, I was too busy with the cannon. And suddenly, it worked. A long burst of fire ripped through the skies. "Hooray!" I cried, "it's working." "Stop, stop," shouted the pilot, and already the first salvos of flak were whistling past us. The Italian air defenses took us for a Heinkel captured by the British. Luckily, their aim was not very good. My pilot fired recognition flares, the Italians stopped firing, and we were able to land. "Thanks for the flight," I called to the sergeant. "Next time, I will bring my own 2 cm cannon." That same day, I flew to Rome on a shuttle plane, was allotted a room in the famous Hotel Excelsior on the Via Veneto by the German liaison officer, and given an appointment with Kesselring for the following morning. Rome seemed almost undisturbed. There was no blackout, as in Germany, there were hardly any military vehicles to be seen, and the famous Via Veneto was pulsating with life as in times of peace. In my faded tropical uniform, I felt out of place. At the hotel, I gave the letters of my Italian friends to the porter, who at once congratulated me with great respect on the Medaglia d'Argento. After a bath, the first for so long, I decided to eat at Chez Alfredo. Alfredo was famous for his spaghetti and had received from the Italian royal family a set of golden cutlery with which he himself served the great personalities of the day. The walls of his little restaurant on the Pin 7 a Colonna were covered with the photographs and dedications of famous politicians, actors, and writers. His golden visitors book offered a cross-section of the prominent from all the world. When Alfredo saw me, he rushed across to me. "Comandante, what an honor and pleasure. Congratulations on the Medaglia d'Argento. I will serve you personally with the best spaghetti, which is still to be had here, in spite of the war." From all the tables, people looked across to me as Alfredo drew his golden cutlery from his pocket to serve the spaghetti. Then the climax, the lights went out. The head waiter brought a flaming omelette surprise to my table and Alfredo cried out in delight, "Ecco maestoso." There was applause from all the tables. I had to get a grip on myself. That morning, I had still been on the last battlefield in North Africa, now a ceremony here that had nothing whatever to do with war and death. I thanked Alfredo. "Wonderful, first class. We could only dream of such things in North Africa. Now we will cap the festive meal with a nice mocha."